Welcome back once again, my friends, to the Legion. If you are new here, please subscribe, and yeah, let's just get right into it. This is part 2, as you can see from the description, of The Color Out of Space. If you have not seen part 1, you definitely need to. Where we left off, they had just found the meteorite. This is a dramatic read-through of the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Color Out of Space, in honor of that new movie coming out starring Nicolas Cage. Hopefully he can redeem himself. I have not seen it, so yeah. Tell me if you liked it in the comments, because if you saw it yourself, tell me if you liked it. Maybe I'll review it on the channel. So, without further ado, here we go. This is part 2. There will probably be a part 3. Maybe even more than that. Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, part 2. The day after that, all this was in June of '82, the professors had trooped out again in great excitement. As they passed Amis, they told him what queer things the specimen had done, and how it had faded wholly away when they put it in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicone. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and showing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax bed, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when, upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands. Unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum, there was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid, and even aqua regia, merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. Ami had difficulty in recalling all of these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There was ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol, ether, nauseous carbon. Again, disclaimer. If I can't pronounce a word, don't judge me. Disulfide, and a dozen others. But although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, and there was no change in the solvents to show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic, for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents, there seemed to be faint traces of the Widdenmestatin figures found on a meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, the testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker that they all left the chips made of the original fragment during the work. The next morning, both chips and beaker were gone, without a trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professors told Ami as they paused at his door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, although this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk, and even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the stages studied its surface curiously as they detached another and larger piece with a hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe. It was only by analogy that they called it color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it, it appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow, spherical space about 3 inches across, and all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the encasing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as its predecessor had been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air, and attacking silicone compounds with mutual destruction as a result, it presented no identifying features whatsoever. And at the end of the tests, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such dowered with outside properties and obedient to outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they met with bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard. And when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with caved-in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment left carefully cased in lead. That fragment lasted a week, and at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it. When it had gone, no residue was left behind, and in time, the professors felt scarcely sure they had even seen with waking eyes that cryptic vestige of fathomless gulfs outside, that lone, weird message from other universes and other realms of matter, force, and energy. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring, and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell upon him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwonted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of spacious lusciousness, not a single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and it was very cold. Ami saw Nahum less often than usual and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown almost taciturn and were far from steady in their church-going or their attendance at the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poorer health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said he was, quote, disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. They were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but he appeared to think that they were not as characteristic of the anatomy and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Ami listened without interest to this talk until one night when he drove past Nahum's house on his sleigh on the way back from Clark's Corners. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of that rabbit were longer than either Ami or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by a firm rein. Thereafter, Ami gave Nahum's tales more respect and wondered why the gardener's dogs had seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way, impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened and threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying away of the horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an odd discussion in Potter's General Store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning, and he had noticed the skunk cabbages were coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they held strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horse had snorted at an odor which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course, it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found that stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them, and one day they paid Nahum a visit. But having no love of wild tales and folklore, were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. As for the footprints and frightened horses, well, of course this was mere country talk when such a phenomenon as the aerolite would be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. And so, all through the strange days, the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, who was given 2 files of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that queer color of the skunk cabbage had been very like one of the bands of light shown by the meteor fragment in the college spectroscope, and like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss. The samples in this analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though they later lost this property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind. But even gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthy listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was, indeed, rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed to half slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early sacrifice came out, it had another strange color, not quite that of the skunk cabbage, but clearly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette, but that dignitary did no more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. Is there such a thing as polite ridicule? I'm not entirely sure, but, whatever. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great, overgrown, mourning cloak butterflies behaved in connection with these sacrifices. Sacriphages. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but again, bear with me. This is a very disturbing tale that I'm telling, and I hope that you will, take it with a grain of salt. It can't possibly be true, let's continue. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in these strange, beautiful colors, and through the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage there sprang up a bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches had become a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Ami and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that it reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped that the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him, waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off, being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed quite unusual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something, but they could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of the maple against the moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything now, yet it was none of Nahum's family who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton, who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark, and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley, which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distinct, luminosity seemed to inhere in all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorus appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house. But toward the end of May, the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which the trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All verdure was growing gray, and was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Ami was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Ami do their errands in town. They were failing, both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. All right, this video's gone on long enough. There will be a part 3. We're making good progress. Let me know if you've never heard this story before. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Remember, this is an H.P. Lovecraft story. I really enjoy this one. I thought this was one of his most unique. I liked other ones more, but this one just felt very weird to me. Like, a lot of the other ones seemed kind of... And I guess he was the first one to come up with them, which made them not cliches, but to me they seemed like cliches when I read them, even though they were really cool. This story was the most unique story I've ever read from Mr. Lovecraft. But, you know, that's just my opinion. Actually, comment below. Tell me what you think the most strange story is by Lovecraft. And again, comment below. Tell me what other stories you want me to dramatically read in my cool voice. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for part 3. See you soon.